The year is 1862, deep in the Mexican jungle. A plantation worker clearing land strikes something with his machete. Not wood, stone. He keeps digging. An hour later, he's staring at something impossible. A human face carved in volcanic rock, larger than any sculpture he's ever seen. 11 feet tall, perfectly preserved, staring back at him across thousands of years. Over the next 150 years, archaeologists would find 16 more of these heads, each one depicting a different man, each one weighing as much as a house. But here's the problem that has haunted archaeology for nearly a century. These faces don't look Mesoamerican. The broad nose, the full lips, the distinctive facial structure isn't Maya or Aztec. And yet, whoever carved these faces possessed engineering capabilities that shouldn't be possible in the ancient world. The Olmec, the culture that created these monuments, would turn out to be the mother culture for every civilization that followed. The Maya inherited their calendar, the Aztec inherited their gods, but the Olmec themselves seem to have inherited their ruling class from somewhere else entirely. Tonight, we're going to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it takes us across an ocean that wasn't supposed to be crossable, to a conclusion that shouldn't be possible. The Mesoamerican civilization that shouldn't exist left us a message. We just have to be willing to read it. So who were the Olmec, and why does their very existence pose such a profound mystery? Let's start at the beginning. The Gulf Coast of Mexico, 1500 years before Christ. Swamps stretch for hundreds of miles. Rivers flood seasonally, drowning the land. Humidity chokes. Mosquitoes swarm. This is not prime real estate for civilization. Yet here, the first great culture of Mesoamerica emerged fully formed. The Aztec called them Olmecatl, the rubber people, because they were the first to process latex from rubber trees. Not simple harvesting, but chemical processing. They mixed milky sap with juice from morning glory vines, creating vulcanized rubber centuries before Charles Goodyear would invent the process in 1839. The Olmec used this rubber for ritual balls in their sacred ball game, for waterproofing, for offerings to the gods. This was the first complex chemistry in the Americas. Archaeological dating places their emergence at San Lorenzo Tenochtitlan around 1500 BCE. The site covers nearly 3 square miles, massive earthen platforms, sophisticated drainage systems carved from basalt, ritual complexes aligned to celestial events. This wasn't a village that slowly grew. San Lorenzo appeared as a fully planned urban center. La Venta rose next, reaching its peak between 900 and 400 BCE. The site features the first pyramid in Mesoamerica, 110 feet above the coastal plain, shaped like a fluted cone, possibly representing a volcano. Surrounding it, plazas, buried offerings of jade and serpentine, and massive stone monuments. These weren't farmers who got lucky, these were architects. But who were the Olmec beyond their monuments? They were master artisans who carved jade with obsidian tools, creating intricate figurines and ceremonial axes that required hundreds of hours of patient work. Traders who established networks stretching from central Mexico to modern-day Honduras, exchanging obsidian, jade, and cacao across 1,000 miles. They were ritualists who performed ceremonial bloodletting, piercing tongues and genitals with stingray spines to communicate with the divine. Ballgayers who built the first courts for a sacred game that would dominate Mesoamerican culture for millennia. A brutal sport where players used their hips to strike a heavy rubber ball, sometimes ending in human sacrifice. They were engineers who constructed sophisticated drainage systems using carved basalt channels, controlling water flow through their cities with precision that wouldn't be matched in the Americas for centuries. At San Lorenzo, they built elaborate stone-lined drains that still function today. They were astronomers who tracked celestial movements and developed the long count calendar, a system capable of measuring vast epochs with mathematical precision. While Europe was in the Bronze Age, the Olmec were calculating dates millions of years into the past and future. They developed the concept of zero, not merely as a placeholder, but as an abstract mathematical entity. This achievement wouldn't appear in the Old World for another 3 centuries. Their writing system, preserved on the Cascajal block discovered in 1999, predates all other New World scripts with 62 distinct symbols arranged in systematic patterns. And they were religious innovators who created the feathered serpent deity, the were-jaguar supernatural being, and the concept of ritual human sacrifice that would define Mesoamerican spirituality. But there's a gap between simple farming villages and San Lorenzo's urban complexity that spans perhaps 2 or 3 centuries. In archaeological terms, that's instantaneous. The Maya would inherit the calendar and refine it. The Zapotec would adapt the writing system. The Aztec would worship Olmec gods. Every subsequent Mesoamerican civilization stood on Olmec foundations, which raises the fundamental question, where did the Olmec get their foundation? The answer may be carved into 17 stone faces that required the labor of thousands. 17 colossal heads. Each depicts a distinct individual, unique facial features, different headdresses, separate identities. These are portraits, not generic representations. The smallest stands nearly 7 feet tall. The largest reaches 11 feet, weighing an estimated 40 tons, equivalent to 7 African elephants stacked together. Every single one was carved from volcanic basalt from the Tuxtla Mountains. The nearest major Olmec site, La Venta, sits 60 miles away. San Lorenzo lies over 90 miles distant. Between the quarries and the cities, rivers, swamps, dense rainforest, and coastal plains that flood annually. The Olmec had no wheels, no beasts of burden, no metal tools, no pulleys or complex machinery, just stone tools and human muscle. Imagine the quarry site. Workers hammer at volcanic rock using basalt hammers, stone pounding stone. The work generates friction heat that can burn skin. Progress measures in inches per day. They must shape the rough block at the quarry itself, because transporting unworked stone would waste precious labor. So they carve the face in the mountain. They define the features, the broad nose, the full lips, the distinctive headdress. They smooth the surface using sand as an abrasive, mixed with water. The sculpture emerges gradually, over months or years, while workers camp at the site, fed by supply chains stretching back to the cities. Then comes the real challenge, separating the head from the bedrock without shattering it. One crack, one miscalculation, and months of work becomes rubble. Geological analysis confirms the Tuxtlas as the sole source. The mineral composition matches volcanic samples from a single mountain range. No shortcuts, no closer quarries. The mountains were only the beginning. The real battle was against geography itself. The Olmec solution. Log rafts floated down rivers during the wet season, supplemented by human labor dragging the stones across land using wooden rollers. Modern researchers attempting to move multi-ton stones using ancient methods estimate approximately 10 people can move 1 ton across flat ground using rollers and ropes. Conservative estimate, 1,500 to 2,000 people mobilized for months to transport a single head. That level of organization doesn't happen casually. You can't conscript 2,000 people, house them, feed them, coordinate them, and sustain the effort long enough to move stone across 90 miles unless the person depicted possesses absolute authority. These weren't community art projects. These were demonstrations of power, proof that the subject could command the labor of thousands, that his status was non-negotiable. The swamps didn't care about status. The rivers didn't care about power. Every mile risked disaster. Rafts could capsize, ropes could snap, rollers could shatter. One mistake drops the portrait into a river, unrecoverable, irreplaceable. They did it anyway, 17 times, which means 17 different men held such sacred or political authority that the Olmec considered the risk and expense mandatory. These men couldn't be denied their monuments. But who were they? Stand before San Lorenzo, Monument 4. The head rises from the earth like a judgment. The face stares with focused intensity, not the serene expression of a deity, but the determined gaze of someone accustomed to command. Each head captures a specific individual, different cheekbones, different jaw lines, different expressions. San Lorenzo 4 appears younger with smoother features. La Venta 3 looks older with deeper creases around the mouth. The headdresses vary dramatically. Some feature close-fitting caps with ear flaps, straps running beneath the chin. Others display elaborate designs, raised elements across the crown, decorative motifs on the sides. Modern interpretation suggests these represent protective gear for the Olmec ballgame, similar to helmets. Others argue for military or ceremonial significance. What matters is the specificity. The sculptors didn't carve generic crowns. They documented exact headgear worn by exact individuals. The expressions convey power. Several heads display slight downturns at the mouth corners, not sadness, but sternness, a ruler's face. The eyes gaze forward with focus. No hint of supplication, no suggestion of uncertainty. These are men who expected obedience. The Olmec possessed the mathematical sophistication to invent zero, the abstract thinking to develop complex calendars, yet they chose stark realism for their most important monuments. They could have carved symbolic representations, jaguar gods, serpent deities, abstract patterns. Instead, they invested massive construction budgets into realistic human portraits. That choice reveals priorities. The individual depicted mattered more than any god. His specific face, his exact features, his unique identity demanded preservation across millennia. Now examine San Lorenzo 6 closely. Note the nasal structure, broad, with a distinctly flattened bridge and wide nostrils flaring to the sides. Compare this to typical indigenous Mesoamerican populations. Straighter bridges, narrower nostrils, different angles. The lips are full, everted, with pronounced volume. The upper lip protrudes noticeably. The lower lip curves outward substantially. Look at the overall facial profile, the relationship between forehead, nose, and chin when viewed from the side. The heads display a specific forward projection of the lower face, creating an angle distinct from the facial profiles documented in Maya, Zapotec, or Aztec populations. Most significantly, the absence of the epicanthic fold, a small fold of skin covering the inner corner of the eye that appears in the majority of Native American populations, inherited from Asian ancestors who crossed the Bering Strait. It's a defining feature of indigenous American facial structure. The colossal heads don't display it. We're dealing with facial features that don't match the population indigenous to the region. Not a subtle variation, but a categorical distinction. Geneticists and physical anthropologists classify human facial features using specific measurements: nasal index, degree of jaw projection, lip thickness, orbital shape. When you quantify the features of these heads and compare them to population averages for Mesoamerica, the numbers diverge. They cluster instead with populations from either West Africa or certain East Asian groups. The traditional Mesoamerican facial template derives from populations who crossed from Siberia into Alaska approximately 15,000 years ago. Those founding populations carried specific genetic traits that remained relatively stable across subsequent millennia. The epicanthic fold, particular dental patterns, specific cranial structures. The heads display a different template entirely. This isn't artistic stylization. Sculptors working in realistic portraiture don't invent new ethnic features. When Renaissance artists painted Medici family members, they captured Italian features. When Egyptian sculptors carved Nubians, they documented African features. When Khmer artists depicted their kings, the stone faces showed Southeast Asian characteristics. The Olmec sculptors saw something, and they carved it with obsessive accuracy. DNA analysis of skeletal remains from Olmec sites shows typical Mesoamerican ancestry in the general population. But the ruling class, the individuals who commanded the labor to move these monuments, may have originated elsewhere. The engineering was miraculous, but the faces themselves tell a story far more shocking. San Lorenzo Monument 3 displays deliberate damage. The nose was broken off systematically, not by erosion, not by accident, but through purposeful strikes concentrated on specific points. The ears were removed with similar precision. Then the head was carefully buried. This pattern repeats across multiple heads. San Lorenzo 17 shows facial damage followed by burial in a specially prepared pit. La Venta 3 was found in respectful interment, despite visible mutilation. The heads weren't destroyed by enemies. They were ritually killed by the Olmec themselves. Archaeologists term this ritual destruction, the ceremonial termination of an object's power. The Olmec performed similar rituals on jade artifacts, ceremonial axes, and stone monuments. Breaking the object releases its spiritual energy, ending its active presence. But monuments destroyed by conquering enemies get smashed, scattered, defaced with contempt. These were damaged with precision and buried with care. The treatment suggests respect combined with necessity. These monuments had to be retired, but their subjects retained sacred status even in death. Ancient Egyptians practiced careful burial of royal statuary when updating temples. The old monuments weren't desecrated, they were respectfully retired. The Olmec ritual suggests something similar. The men depicted had died, or their dynasty had ended, or their age had passed. The monuments marking their authority had to be ceremonially terminated and buried, just as the kings themselves had been buried. That level of care, deliberately damaging and then carefully interring massive portraits, indicates these weren't generic depictions of kingship. They represented specific men whose power was so profound that even their stone images required ritual death. Connect the unusual facial features with the ritual treatment. The heads display non-Mesoamerican characteristics. They required immense labor investment. They were ritually killed and buried with reverence. One interpretation explains all three elements. The heads depicted founding ancestors, foreign-born individuals who established the Olmec state, ruled as the original elite, and were memorialized precisely because they were different. Founding ancestor veneration appears across human cultures. Rome lionized Romulus. China honored the Yellow Emperor. Egypt revered the first pharaohs. Cultures memorialize their founders, especially when those founders are perceived as bringing civilization itself. The Olmec may have done the same. Foreign visitors, whether African, Asian, or from another source, arrived with knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, urban planning, and centralized statecraft. They possessed this knowledge because they came from older civilizations that had already developed it over centuries. The indigenous Mesoamerican population, already present and skilled in agriculture and social organization, encountered these visitors. Rather than viewing them as enemies, the population integrated them as a ruling elite. The visitors' knowledge granted them authority. Their different appearance marked them as special, possibly divine. These founding kings ruled, taught, and eventually died. Their descendants, genetically blended or indigenous successors who inherited the political structure, continued the civilization. But they memorialized the founders with colossal portraits, documenting their distinctive features with absolute realism. Centuries later, when the age of the founding ancestors had definitively ended, the Olmec ritually killed the monuments. Not to dishonor them, but to mark the transition from the founders' era to fully indigenous rule. The ritual burial acknowledged that while the founders' knowledge and political structure remained, their direct lineage had passed. The heads became archaeological time capsules, historical records documenting the moment of contact between indigenous Mesoamerica and visitors from across the ocean. Ivan van Sertima published, "They came before Columbus in 1976, arguing that West African and specifically Nubian peoples reached the Americas centuries before European contact." He focused on the colossal heads as primary evidence. Compare San Lorenzo 6 to documented Nubian facial structure from ancient Sudan. The nasal structure matches: broad, flattened bridge, wide nostrils. The lip characteristics correspond: pronounced eversion, substantial volume. The jaw projection aligns with patterns common in West African populations. Van Sertima documented specific parallels in cranial shape and ear morphology. Some heads display what boxers call cauliflower ears, thickened and deformed from repeated trauma. consistent with either combat or the brutal Olmec ball game. The morphological case is both visual and quantifiable. Place a colossal head next to photographs of Nubian or West African individuals, and the similarity is striking. But how would they have arrived? The Canary Current flows southward along the West African coast, merging with the North Equatorial Current that sweeps westward across the Atlantic. This current system naturally pushes any vessel caught in it toward the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. Ships don't need to navigate intentionally. Accident suffices. A fishing vessel blown off course from West Africa gets caught in the current. Weeks later, it makes landfall in Mexico. Ancient Egyptians and Nubians possessed sophisticated boat-building technology. Reed boats, wooden vessels capable of maritime navigation along the Red Sea and Mediterranean. Herodotus documented Phoenician circumnavigation of Africa commissioned by Egyptian pharaoh Necho II around 600 BCE. The Atlantic is narrower than most realize. From West Africa to Brazil measures roughly 1,800 miles, less distance than from England to North America, which Vikings crossed routinely by 1000 CE. Thor Heyerdahl proved viability in 1970 with Ra II, a reed boat built using ancient Egyptian techniques. He sailed from Morocco to Barbados in 57 days, covering 3,270 miles. The voyage demonstrated that ancient boat technology could survive Atlantic crossings. Van Sertima proposed that small groups of African seafarers, whether through accident or exploration, reached Mexico between 1500 and 800 BCE. The indigenous population encountered these foreign visitors, and contact resulted in integration at the elite level. African visitors became kings, possibly through marriage alliances, religious authority, or technological superiority in warfare or statecraft. Cultural parallels extend beyond facial features. The Olmec practiced cranial deformation, deliberately reshaping infant skulls, a practice that existed in ancient Egypt and Nubia. They practiced dental modification, filing teeth or inlaying them with jade. Similar practices appear in various African cultures. The headdresses resemble protective gear documented in West African warrior cultures. A competing theory proposes Asian influence, particularly from Shang Dynasty China. The Olmec didn't simply value jade, they were consumed by it. They traveled hundreds of miles to quarry it from distant sources, carved it into intricate ritual objects, buried jade offerings in massive quantities. Shang Dynasty China, 1600 to 1046 BCE, displayed identical obsession. Elite burials contained hundreds of jade artifacts. In 2000, Chinese scholar Mike Xu published detailed comparisons of Olmec and Shang jade artifacts. Specific dragon motifs, the treatment of serpent scales, the stylistic rendering of claws, the parallels were precise. The timing aligns. The Olmec emerged around 1500 BCE. The Shang dynasty flourished from 1600 to 1046 BCE. Instead of the Atlantic's Canary Current, Asian contact would have utilized the Kuroshio Current, flowing northward along the Japanese coast before sweeping eastward across the North Pacific. Any vessel caught in this current travels directly toward the North American coast. Japanese archaeologists have documented sophisticated maritime capabilities dating to 14,000 BCE. By 1500 BCE, Chinese and Japanese societies possessed boats capable of extended ocean voyages. The Pacific crossing is longer, approximately 5,000 miles from Japan to California, but the Kuroshio Current provides a natural highway. Difficult, but not impossible. The Cascajal block, discovered in 1999, displays 62 distinct symbols arranged in horizontal rows. Dating places it around 900 BCE, making it the oldest writing system in the Americas. Several symbols bear striking resemblance to early Chinese logograms from the Shang and Zhou dynasties. Specific characters representing natural elements, water, mountain, sky, display similar graphic structures. Mike Xu argued that up to 150 Olmec symbols share graphic similarities with Shang dynasty oracle bone script. The structural principles, the methods of combining elements to create meaning, the visual vocabulary, all suggest possible transmission. Writing represents humanity's most complex cultural technology. The earliest systems, Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Chinese characters, required centuries of development. The Olmec writing appears without a clear evolutionary record. No proto-writing stage, no experimental phase. This argues for transmission rather than independent invention. If writing was transferred, it suggests a teacher-student relationship, literate individuals from an existing civilization instructing indigenous Mesoamericans. That level of knowledge transfer requires sustained contact, not a brief accidental landing. It suggests long-term presence, possibly a small group integrating into indigenous society while transmitting accumulated knowledge. The long count calendar measures time in units spanning millions of years. The system uses 5 distinct cycles: kin, day; uinal, 20 days; tun, 360 days; katun, 7,200 days; and baktun, 144,000 days. A full cycle equals 5,125 years, the span from creation to destruction in Olmec Maya cosmology. This isn't a farmer's calendar tracking planting seasons. This is a mathematical system designed to measure geological epochs, to calculate dates millions of years in the past and future. The precision is staggering. The Olmec calculated the solar year at 365.2420 days, accurate to within minutes of modern measurements using atomic clocks. They tracked Venus cycles with equivalent precision, predicting the planet's synodic period, 583.92 days, with accuracy modern astronomy didn't achieve until the 19th century. They calculated these numbers using naked-eye observation and stone monuments as alignment markers. No telescopes, no precision instruments, no calculators, just systematic observation, geometric understanding, and mathematical sophistication. The concept of zero emerged within this calendar system, not as a placeholder, but as an abstract entity representing absence, nullity, the mathematical concept of nothing. This is one of humanity's most profound intellectual achievements. Zero appeared in Olmec inscriptions by 300 BCE. The concept wouldn't reach Europe until the 12th century CE. The Olmec invented it first. But astronomical knowledge of this level requires accumulated data. You can't achieve Venus cycle precision from a few years of observation. You need decades, possibly centuries, of systematic recording, noting positions, tracking cycles, comparing predictions to observations, refining calculations. Compare Olmec achievement to Old World development. Mesopotamian astronomy evolved over 3,000 years from basic star catalogs to sophisticated planetary predictions. Egyptian astronomy developed incrementally from simple solar year calculations to complex temple alignments. The pattern is always the same: slow accumulation, incremental refinement, centuries of recorded observations building toward precision. The Olmec went from agricultural villages to the long count calendar in roughly 3 centuries. That acceleration defies the normal pattern of knowledge development. Mathematics isn't intuitive, it's systematic, building complex operations from simple foundations. You can't invent calculus without first developing algebra, geometry, arithmetic. The progression is mandatory because each level depends on mastering the previous one. The Olmec display mastery of advanced concepts: zero, long count cycles, astronomical prediction, without documented mastery of foundational stages. Consider an alternative scenario. A small group of visitors from an older civilization arrives in Mesoamerica. They possess accumulated astronomical knowledge from their homeland, centuries of recorded observations, tested calculations, refined mathematical systems. They teach this knowledge to indigenous Mesoamericans, not slowly developing it over centuries, but transmitting the completed system. The recipients are intellectually capable. They learn, they understand, they apply the knowledge. But they didn't have to invent it from scratch. This explains the speed. Transfer of existing knowledge happens faster than independent invention. The Olmec created the foundational mythology that would dominate Mesoamerican religion for 3 millennia, the feathered serpent. The Maya called him Kukulkan. The Aztec knew him as Quetzalcoatl. But the image originated with the Olmec, a serpent adorned with feathers, combining earth and sky, water and air, representing the synthesis of opposites. Olmec iconography depicts the feathered serpent in jade carvings, stone reliefs, and ceremonial objects. The creature appears in creation narratives, agricultural rituals, and royal regalia. Across Mesoamerican cultures, the feathered serpent is associated with a culture hero who arrived from the east, across the water. Aztec legend described Quetzalcoatl as a bearded man with pale skin who came from across the eastern sea on a raft, bringing civilization, agriculture, and knowledge. When he departed, he promised to return from the same direction. The Maya told similar stories about Kukulkan, a divine teacher who arrived by sea, established cities, taught astronomy and agriculture, then departed across the water. We lack Olmec written narratives. But the fact that multiple successor cultures, all deriving their religious foundations from the Olmec, preserved this specific narrative suggests it originated in the earlier period. Oral tradition preserves historical kernels wrapped in mythological elaboration. Greek mythology preserved the Trojan War for centuries before Homer. Norse sagas documented actual Viking settlements in Iceland and Greenland centuries after the events. Biblical narratives encoded historical migrations and conflicts. The widespread Mesoamerican myth of civilizing gods arriving from the sea, bringing knowledge and establishing rulership, may encode actual historical memory. The integration of foreign knowledge bearers into indigenous society transformed over centuries into divine narrative. The Olmecs' relationship with water extended beyond practical necessity into religious obsession. Jade, their most precious material, was valued specifically for its green color, which the Olmec associated with water, vegetation, and fertility. The site of El Manatee, discovered in 1987, provided direct evidence. Archaeologists excavated a spring where the Olmec made offerings continuously over centuries. Wooden busts, jade axes, rubber balls, stone tools, all carefully placed in water. The offerings were systematic, repeated, part of sustained religious practice centered on water sources. This emphasis makes sense for people who remembered their founders arriving from across the sea. If your civilization's origin story involves ocean voyages, water becomes more than a resource. It becomes the medium of divine contact. The Olmec's devotion to water, jade green symbolism, and sea-associated mythology creates a coherent pattern. These were people whose cultural memory included the ocean as the source of their civilization's foundation. The colossal heads dominate our attention, but they're only one piece of the Olmec puzzle. To understand who these rulers were and where they might have come from, we need to understand the civilization they built and the vast network they controlled. The Olmec weren't isolated villagers. They were the center of a trade empire that stretched over 1,000 miles across Mesoamerica. Obsidian, volcanic glass prized for making razor-sharp blades, came from sources in central Mexico, over 400 miles from Olmec heartland. Archaeologists have traced specific obsidian artifacts back to their source quarries using chemical analysis. The Olmec weren't just receiving obsidian through intermediaries. They were directly accessing distant sources, which means they controlled trade routes, maintained relationships with distant communities, and possessed the organizational capacity to move materials across enormous distances. Jade came from even farther away. The Olmec prized jade above all materials, and the nearest sources lay in modern Guatemala, over 600 miles south of La Venta. They imported tons of it, not exaggeration, literal tons. Excavations at Olmec sites have uncovered massive jade caches, including over 16 tons of serpentine and jade blocks buried in a single offering at La Venta. 16 tons of jade, transported 600 miles, using no wheels, no beasts of burden, no metal tools. Cacao came from the tropical lowlands, feathers from tropical birds, quetzals, macaws, came from cloud forests hundreds of miles away. Marine shells came from both Pacific and Caribbean coasts. The Olmec were importing materials from every ecological zone in Mesoamerica, but trade wasn't one-directional. Olmec artifacts, distinctive pottery styles, jade carvings, iconographic motifs, appear across Mesoamerica. Olmec-style ceramics have been found in central Mexico, in Oaxaca, in Chiapas, in Guatemala. The distribution suggests either Olmec traders traveling across the region or Olmec cultural influence so powerful that distant communities adopted their artistic styles. This level of integration required sophisticated logistics, rest stations along trade routes, storage facilities for goods in transit, diplomatic relationships with communities along the routes, security to protect valuable cargoes, record-keeping to track transactions. The Olmec weren't just building cities, they were building the first Mesoamerican trade network, an interconnected system that prefigured the later Maya and Aztec economies. Around 900 BCE, something catastrophic happened at San Lorenzo. The site was systematically destroyed, not by natural disaster, not by gradual abandonment, by deliberate, organized violence. Monuments were toppled and mutilated. The colossal heads were damaged and buried. But this happened before the ceremonial killing we discussed earlier. This was different. This was angry. Stone drains were smashed. Buildings were burned. The destruction was so thorough that archaeologists initially thought the site had been completely abandoned. But here's what's strange. The destruction appears to have been internal, not from outside invaders. There's no evidence of foreign pottery styles appearing after the destruction, which you'd expect if conquerors had moved in. No new architectural styles, no different burial practices. The people who destroyed San Lorenzo were Olmec themselves, or at least they left no archaeological trace of being different. What could cause a population to turn on their own city with such violence? Some archaeologists suggest political revolution, a subordinate population rising against their elite rulers. Others propose religious transformation, where new beliefs demanded the destruction of old monuments. Some suggest ecological catastrophe. The rivers that made San Lorenzo viable may have changed course, making the site untenable and triggering social collapse. But there's another possibility, one that connects to our central mystery. What if this was the moment when indigenous Olmec populations rejected their foreign-born ruling class? Think about it. For generations, perhaps centuries, a foreign elite had ruled. They had introduced new knowledge, new gods, new ways of organizing society. They had demanded the labor to move 40-ton monuments. They had controlled access to trade goods, to jade, to the prestigious items that marked status. Then something shifted. Maybe the foreign king's special knowledge became common. Maybe their divine status eroded. Maybe indigenous Olmec elites, educated in the foreign king's own systems, decided they didn't need foreign rulers anymore. The result? Systematic destruction of the monuments representing foreign power. The colossal heads were attacked not by enemies of the Olmec, but by Olmec themselves reclaiming their civilization. This would explain why the heads were damaged but then carefully buried. Anger demanded their destruction. But cultural memory, the recognition that these founding ancestors had brought real knowledge and benefit, demanded they be treated with some respect in death. After San Lorenzo's destruction, power shifted to La Venta, which flourished for another 500 years. But La Venta's artistic style evolved. The faces carved there, while still powerful, look more generically Mesoamerican. The obsessive realism of San Lorenzo's portraits gives way to more stylized representations, as if the civilization no longer needed to document the distinctive features of foreign rulers because the rulers were no longer foreign. By 400 BCE, La Venta itself was abandoned. The Olmec civilization, as a distinct culture, effectively ended. But its influence didn't disappear. It transformed into every major civilization that followed. The Maya, emerging around 250 CE, inherited the long count calendar almost unchanged. They adopted the Olmec writing system and expanded it into full hieroglyphic script. They worshipped gods whose iconography traced directly to Olmec prototypes. Their kings practiced bloodletting rituals identical to Olmec practices. Even their urban planning, pyramids surrounded by plazas with buried offerings, followed Olmec templates. The Zapotec, developing in Oaxaca around 500 BCE, built their first cities using architectural principles pioneered by the Olmec. Their earliest writing samples show clear Olmec influence. Their elite burials included jade and obsidian objects obtained through trade networks the Olmec had established. The Aztec, arriving in central Mexico much later around 1300 CE, considered themselves inheritors of ancient Mesoamerican tradition. They worshipped Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, whose origins traced directly to Olmec iconography. They played the ball game the Olmec invented. They used calendrical systems based on Olmec mathematics. Every major achievement of later Mesoamerican civilizations, writing, calendars, mathematics, urban planning, monumental architecture, religious iconography, can be traced back to Olmec origins. This is why archaeologists call them the mother culture. Not because they directly controlled later civilizations, but because they established the foundational template that all successors followed. But here's the critical question. If the Olmec established this template, where did they get it? The traditional answer is that they invented it through indigenous genius over centuries of gradual development. But as we've seen, the archaeological evidence doesn't support gradual development. The Olmec appeared suddenly, with sophisticated systems already in place. The alternative answer is that they inherited their template from foreign visitors who brought accumulated knowledge from older civilizations, Egyptian, Nubian, Chinese, or others, and transmitted it to indigenous Mesoamerican populations who then built upon it, refined it, and made it their own. If this is true, then every pyramid the Maya built, every date the Aztec calculated, every god worshipped across 3,000 years of Mesoamerican history, all of it traces back not just to the Olmec, but potentially to knowledge that crossed an ocean. The stakes of this question couldn't be higher. We're not just talking about the Olmec. We're talking about the entire foundation of ancient American civilization. Before we reach our conclusion, there's a category of evidence that deserves its own examination: physical artifacts and biological evidence that mainstream archaeology either dismisses or struggles to explain. In 1992, German toxicologist Svetlana Balabanova analyzed hair samples from ancient Egyptian mummies stored in Munich. She was testing for environmental contamination. What she found instead shocked the scientific community: cocaine and nicotine. Both substances come exclusively from plants native to the Americas: coca from South America, tobacco from North America. Neither plant existed in Africa or the Old World before 1492. The findings were published in peer-reviewed journals. They were replicated by other laboratories. The cocaine and nicotine were not surface contamination. They were embedded in the hair shaft, proving the individuals had consumed these substances while alive. Mainstream archaeology's response was swift and dismissive: contamination, despite multiple labs ruling it out. Or perhaps the mummies weren't actually Egyptian, despite museum documentation. Or maybe similar plants existed in Africa but went extinct, despite no botanical evidence. Any explanation except the obvious one: trade contact between Egypt and the Americas before Columbus. Now, Egyptian mummies with American substances don't prove the Olmec had foreign rulers. But they establish something crucial. Transoceanic contact before Columbus was physically possible because it demonstrably happened. If cocaine reached Egypt from South America, why couldn't people travel the shorter distance from Africa to Mexico? In 2001, a team of geneticists led by Eric Trinkaus published findings about a skeleton discovered near Spirit Cave, Nevada, dated to approximately 7,400 BCE. The cranial morphology didn't match typical Native American patterns. It matched Polynesian and Southeast Asian populations, Similar findings emerged from Kennewick Man, discovered in Washington state in 1996, dated to approximately 7,300 BCE. The skeletal structure suggested possible connections to Polynesian or Ainu populations from Japan, not to Siberian populations who crossed the Bering Strait. These discoveries sparked intense controversy, particularly with Native American tribes who claimed the remains under NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Protection and Repatriation Act. The legal battles overshadowed the scientific questions, and eventually the remains were repatriated without full genetic analysis. But the implications linger. If ancient American populations were more genetically diverse than the Bering Strait model suggests, if people from Polynesia or Asia reached the Americas much earlier than thought, then the presence of foreign genetic markers in Olmec ruling elites becomes less implausible. More recently, DNA analysis of indigenous Brazilian populations revealed unexpected genetic markers suggesting possible Polynesian contact around 1000 CE, still pre-Columbian, but much later than the Olmec. If Polynesians crossed the Pacific in the medieval period, why not earlier? Several plants domesticated in the Americas appear in Polynesia and Southeast Asia before European contact. The sweet potato, indigenous to South America, was cultivated in Polynesia by 1000 CE at the latest, possibly as early as 700 CE. The bottle gourd, originally from Africa, appears in the Americas around 8000 BCE, thousands of years before humans supposedly could have transported it. Cotton plants show a similar mystery. Old World cotton, Gossypium herbaceum, and New World cotton, Gossypium hirsutum, hybridized to create modern cotton varieties. But when did this hybridization occur? Genetic analysis suggests it happened around 1000 to 1500 CE, but archaeological evidence shows advanced cotton cultivation in the Americas much earlier. These botanical mysteries don't prove human contact, but they prove that biological materials crossed the oceans before Columbus. Whether by accident, floating on currents, by birds, or by human transport. If plants crossed the oceans, boats could have too. Over the decades, various Old World artifacts have been reported from American contexts. Roman coins, Chinese anchors, Phoenician inscriptions. Almost universally, mainstream archaeology has dismissed them as hoaxes, misidentifications, or modern contamination. And honestly, most of them probably are. The burden of proof for extraordinary claims is high, and many discoveries come from amateur collectors without proper archaeological context. But the blanket dismissal creates a problem. Even legitimate finds get ignored because the entire subject has been tainted by hoaxes. Consider the Bat Creek stone, discovered in Tennessee in 1889 during a Smithsonian excavation. It features what some interpret as ancient Hebrew script. The Smithsonian initially filed it as Cherokee writing. Later analysis suggested the Hebrew was actually copied from a Masonic reference book. Hoax? Probably. But the Smithsonian's handling of the artifact, decades of storage without proper analysis, then dismissal, reflects a broader pattern. Institutions are so committed to the isolationist model that they don't rigorously investigate potential counter-evidence. The academic establishment isn't engaged in conspiracy. They're engaged in pattern matching. They see the countless hoaxes and frauds, and they apply that template to everything. Extraordinary claims get dismissed without extraordinary investigation, because investigating every fringe claim would consume resources better spent elsewhere. But what if, among the noise of hoaxes, there's signal? What if legitimate evidence gets dismissed because it contradicts the paradigm? To be fair, mainstream archaeology does have strong evidence for isolationism. DNA analysis of indigenous American populations shows clear descent from Siberian populations who crossed the Bering Strait. The genetic markers are unambiguous. Native Americans are related to East Asian populations, not to Africans or Europeans. This genetic evidence is solid. It proves the primary ancestry of indigenous Americans. But it doesn't disprove the presence of a small foreign elite. Genetics works through population majority. If 99% of the Olmec population descended from Siberian migrants and 1% descended from African or Asian visitors, the genetic signal from that 1% would be invisible in population-wide studies, especially if that 1% was elite males who bred with local women, diluting the foreign genetic markers within generations. The absence of genetic evidence for African or Asian ancestry in the general Olmec population doesn't contradict the possibility of foreign ruling elites. It actually supports it. The rulers were foreign, the population was indigenous. The technological evidence is also strong. Mainstream archaeology argues that everything the Olmec achieved, the mathematics, the astronomy, the urban planning, falls within the range of independent human innovation. Pyramids appeared independently in multiple cultures. Writing appeared independently. Complex calendars appeared independently. This is true. Humans are capable of remarkable independent innovation. But the speed of Olmec development strains this explanation. Independent innovation usually takes centuries, even millennia. The Olmec compressed this timeline dramatically. Transfer of existing knowledge from visitors who possessed it explains the speed better than independent invention. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, diffusionism was weaponized to justify colonialism. European scholars argued that indigenous peoples couldn't develop civilization independently, requiring Old World guidance. These theories denied indigenous agency, suggesting that brown-skinned people couldn't achieve sophistication without white or Asian intervention. By the mid-20th century, archaeology had rightfully rejected this framework. The discipline embraced isolationism partly as scientific correction. Evidence showed indigenous Americans did develop independently, but also as political stance. Rejecting diffusionism became synonymous with respecting indigenous accomplishment. This created an environment where proposing any transoceanic contact became taboo. Even raising the question invited accusations of racism, of undermining indigenous heritage. But the question of the Olmec colossal heads isn't about who built Olmec civilization. The civilization was demonstrably built by Mesoamerican peoples, indigenous populations who quarried the stone, transported the monuments, constructed the cities, sustained the agriculture, developed the society. The question is specifically about the composition of the small ruling elite represented by 17 portraits. That's a question of population genetics within a specific social class, not a challenge to indigenous achievement. Historians don't deny Macedonian achievement by acknowledging that Alexander the Great's armies included Greek, Persian, and Egyptian officers. The accomplishments belonged to Macedonia, even if the leadership was ethnically diverse. The same principle applies to the Olmec. If the founding elite included African or Asian individuals, that doesn't transfer ownership of Olmec civilization to Africa or Asia. The civilization remains indigenous Mesoamerican, with all its genius, innovation, and achievement intact. Mainstream scholars assert that the morphological features result from artistic convention, not genetic reality. The were-jaguar dominates Olmec iconography, a supernatural being displaying specific features: downturned mouth corners, broad nose, snarling expression. According to mainstream interpretation, the colossal heads represent elaborately stylized were-jaguar features applied to human forms. Alternative explanations focus on the subject's physical condition. Full faces and broad features might depict elite individuals whose access to abundant food resulted in obesity, or the heads might represent infants with naturally broad noses and round faces. The technical argument addresses carving limitations. Basalt is extremely hard volcanic rock. Carving fine details requires tremendous effort using stone tools. The sculptors may have simplified facial features by necessity. The strongest mainstream criticism targets the mechanism. If African or Asian visitors arrived with such profound influence, where are their artifacts? If they brought boats, where are the remains? If they carried tools, weapons, pottery, where's the physical evidence? No undeniably Old World object has been found in a secure, pre-Columbian Olmec context. No Egyptian pottery shards, No Chinese bronze vessels, no African iron tools. Every claimed Old World artifact that could prove pre-Columbian contact suffers from questionable provenance. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Proposing that foreign elites ruled the Olmec is an extraordinary claim. 17 stone faces with unusual features don't constitute extraordinary evidence when alternative explanations exist. The diffusionist counterargument reframes the nature of contact. Perhaps the visitors weren't merchants carrying trade goods or colonists establishing permanent settlements. Perhaps they were a small elite group, a handful of individuals arriving accidentally, possessing knowledge rather than cargo. Consider, a single boat blown off course carries 15 to 20 people. They possess knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, writing, urban planning. But their material possessions are minimal. They arrive in Mesoamerica and integrate into the indigenous population. Their power derives from knowledge, not technology. When they die, they're buried with Olmec grave goods, not foreign artifacts. Their children are genetically and culturally blended. The original foreign material culture disappears within decades. This model explains the absence of artifacts while preserving the hypothesis. The contact was ideological and elite, not commercial or colonial. Knowledge transferred, not trade goods. But this reasoning frustrates mainstream archaeologists precisely because it makes the theory unfalsifiable. If any absence of evidence can be explained away, the hypothesis becomes immune to disproof. Step back from the controversy and focus on what physically exists. 17 stone portraits, each carved from volcanic basalt and transported across impossible terrain using Stone Age technology. Each head depicts a distinct individual with realistic, specific features. Those features display characteristics inconsistent with indigenous Mesoamerican populations: broad nasal structures, full lips, jaw projection, absence of epicanthic folds. The Olmec carved these faces. They invested decades of labor and massive resources to create them. They treated the monuments with sacred reverence, ritually destroying and carefully burying them when the subject's era ended. The simplest explanation, the one requiring the fewest assumptions, is that the Olmec documented what they saw. They carved the actual faces of their rulers. Those rulers looked different from the general population because they came from elsewhere. This doesn't diminish Olmec achievement. The indigenous Mesoamerican population quarried the stone, carved the faces, transported the monuments, built the civilization, developed the agriculture, organized the society. They did everything, but they may have done it under the initial leadership of foreign-born elites who brought accumulated knowledge from older civilizations. Those elites integrated, intermarried, and within generations became genetically and culturally Mesoamerican. The heads document the transition moment, the brief historical window when the founders were still visibly foreign, before genetic blending made their descendants indistinguishable from the general population. The Olmec themselves left this record. They chose to memorialize their founders in permanent monuments, documenting their distinctive features with obsessive realism. They could have carved generic representations of power. They could have created abstract symbols. They chose portraiture. That choice suggests the specific individuals mattered. Their distinctive appearance mattered. Their foreign origin mattered enough to document in monuments that could survive millennia. The evidence forms a coherent pattern. Immense transport effort proving sacred status, morphological features indicating foreign origin, ritual destruction marking transitional eras, advanced knowledge suggesting transmission from older civilizations, cultural mythology encoding arrival narratives, water-focused religious symbolism. The pattern suggests a specific historical scenario. A small group of foreign-born individuals, whether from West Africa, East Asia, or another source, arrived in Mesoamerica around 1500 BCE. They possessed accumulated knowledge: astronomy, mathematics, urban planning, writing principles, centralized statecraft. The indigenous population encountered these visitors. The contact produced integration at the elite level. The visitors became kings through demonstrated knowledge, religious authority, or organizational advantage. They transmitted their knowledge, established the first cities, organized monumental construction, created the political structures that would define Mesoamerican civilization for 3 millennia. Their descendants, genetically blended or culturally adopted indigenous successors, continued the civilization, refined the knowledge, expanded the cities, became fully integrated into Mesoamerican society. When the founders' direct lineage ended, the Olmec ritually destroyed and buried the monuments, marking the transition while preserving the memory. The 17 colossal heads are historical records left by the Olmec themselves, permanent documentation of a moment when the first great civilization of the Americas was founded by rulers who arrived from across the water. Modern archaeology resists this conclusion because acknowledging it requires confronting uncomfortable questions about human migration, cultural transmission, and the complexity of indigenous American history. But the faces remain, carved with precision, buried with care, preserved across millennia. The Olmec shouldn't exist, not according to traditional narratives of isolated, gradual development. Yet they did exist, and they left evidence of their origins for anyone willing to look past political controversy and see what's actually there. If you found this investigation compelling, leave a like and subscribe for more deep dives into historical mysteries. Until next time, sweet dreams and keep questioning.